them toxic as if her fans, because KTV is a Caitlin Clark fan. She's my favorite basketball player.
What detonated out of Stephanie White's mouth didn't just light a spark, it ignited a full-scale inferno that ripped straight through the heart of the WNBA, unleashing shockwaves so violent they shook fan bases, analysts, front offices, and even casual viewers to their core. Because White didn't offer a subtle opinion, she didn't make a diplomatic observation, and she sure as hell didn't try to de-escalate anything. Instead, she stepped up to the microphone with the fury of a ticking time bomb and launched a direct, unapologetic, scorched-earth verbal missile, branding fans as toxic in a tone so sharp, so pointed, and so undeniably loaded that millions instantly recognized it as a veiled, but barely veiled, attack on Caitlin Clark's massive, passionate, and fiercely protective fan base, a fan base that has spent the last 12 months breaking records, rewriting the economics of the league, and elevating the WNBA to heights it hasn't touched in nearly 3 decades, yet somehow became the target of White's misplaced outrage. And the reaction to her inflammatory proclamation was not slow, not cautious, and not divided. It was immediate, volcanic, and explosively unanimous, erupting across social media, sports talk shows, live broadcasts, and comment sections with a level of hostility and disbelief so intense that it instantly became clear this wasn't a slip-up, this wasn't miscommunication, and this wasn't a moment of heat. This was a deliberate, calculated, and stunningly reckless decision from a head coach who seemed more driven by emotion than logic, more motivated by resentment than leadership, and more focused on attacking the very audience that propelled her team into financial stability than on addressing the deeply fractured environment she helped create. And now, as the digital world burns under the weight of her words, as hashtags demanding her resignation trend at lightning speed, as fans flood league offices with complaints, as analysts dissect every frame of her statement, and as players attempt to distance themselves from the chaos, the Indiana Fever, and the entire WNBA find themselves trapped in a PR crisis the size of a supernova. One that threatens not only the reputation of the franchise but the fragile balance of a league still fighting for mainstream respect. Because what White unleashed was not just controversial, not just tone-deaf, and not just unprofessional, it was catastrophic. A kind of self-inflicted disaster that experts are calling one of the most damaging public comments ever made by a coach in the modern history of women's sports. A shocking show of hostility that instantly alienated the same fans whose money, loyalty, and relentless engagement are driving the WNBA's unprecedented growth, leaving everyone from die-hard supporters to confused newcomers asking the same furious, incredulous question: how could a coach be so disastrously out of touch with the very force keeping her team, and her job, alive? And as this firestorm intensifies, as her words echo across the sports world like an earthquake, as critics frame her comments as professional malpractice and a nuclear leave miscalculation, as insiders leak whispers of locker room divides, as commentators highlight her year-long tension with Caitlin Clark's popularity, and as millions demand accountability like never before, it's becoming brutally clear that this wasn't an accidental spark. This was a self-aimed detonation, a complete and total meltdown that may very well define Stephanie White's legacy more than any coaching achievement ever could. But the real shockwave, the one that turned this controversy from a wildfire into a full-blown, league-shaking, reputation-obliterating superstorm, erupted when fans and analysts finally stepped back and connected the dots, realizing that Stephanie White's tirade wasn't coming out of nowhere but was instead the latest, most radioactive chapter in a long, simmering pattern of tension, insecurity, and barely concealed resentment toward the unprecedented cultural phenomenon known as Caitlin Clark. Because as soon as people began analyzing White's past interviews, post-game comments, and sideline behavior, an unmistakable pattern emerged, painting a picture of a coach who has repeatedly struggled, publicly and privately, to accept, acknowledge, and adapt to the once-in-a-generation force that Clark represents, a force that has not only transformed the Indiana Fever from a forgotten basement-dwelling franchise into the single most talked-about team in women's basketball, but has also redefined the sports economy, shattered viewership ceilings, and attracted millions of new fans who treat Clark not just as a player but as a cultural movement. And instead of embracing that momentum, instead of strategically aligning herself with it, instead of recognizing the miracle of being handed the most valuable marketing gift the WNBA has ever received, White has consistently responded with clipped comments, lukewarm praise, suspiciously timed criticisms, passive-aggressive talking points, and a strange obsession with steering attention toward anyone but Clark, culminating in this latest meltdown, which has now exposed her not just as a coach under pressure but as someone who appears fundamentally threatened by the magnitude of the star she was entrusted to lead. And as this reality spreads like gasoline across social platforms, fans aren't holding back. They're dissecting every contradiction, resurfacing every dismissive comment, replaying every awkward press conference, and highlighting every moment where White seemed more determined to balance narratives than to ride the wave of success Clark created. And this scrutiny has only fueled the fury, with thousands now calling this not a mistake, not a moment of frustration, but the clearest evidence yet that White is emotionally incapable of coaching a superstar who eclipses the entire league. And the backlash has spiraled so intensely that sports journalists are openly questioning whether the Fever's front office can afford to keep her another week without risking permanent reputational damage, especially now that the public has framed this controversy not as a fan-coach disagreement but as a power struggle, a clash between an old guard struggling to maintain control and a new era led by a young athlete whose popularity has dwarfed every system, structure, and ego standing in her way. And what makes this even more disastrous for White is the growing belief that her attack on fans wasn't really about toxicity at all but was instead a desperate misfire, a frantic attempt to push back against an unstoppable cultural shift she no longer knows how to manage. Because while her words were aimed at internet negativity, everyone knew exactly who she was targeting, and the attempt to disguise it only made the blowback 10 times worse, exposing a deep, festering resentment that fans, analysts, and insiders have long suspected. And now the league is facing a nightmare scenario. Because when a coach alienates a handful of fans, it's manageable. But when a coach alienates the single biggest fan base the WNBA has ever seen, the group responsible for record-breaking ticket sales, merch surges, and astronomical broadcast numbers, the fallout becomes catastrophic. A threat not only to the Fever's public standing but to the entire league's trajectory. Because Clark's following isn't just big, it's global, unified, fiercely protective, and deeply emotionally invested. And when you antagonize that many people simultaneously, you don't just spark outrage, you spark a movement, a digital revolt, a tidal wave of resentment that no PR department, no press conference, no half-hearted apology can slow down. And as this backlash intensifies, as reporters label White's comments the most self-destructive quote of the season, as insiders whisper about locker room discomfort, as sponsors nervously observe social sentiment charts exploding in real time, and as millions of fans demand accountability at a volume the league has never faced, one brutal truth is becoming impossible to ignore. Stephanie White didn't just insult fans, she declared war on the very force keeping the WNBA alive, and in doing so, she may have triggered the most consequential leadership crisis in modern women's basketball, a scandal that will be studied, debated, and dissected long after this season ends, because this wasn't a miscalculation. This was professional self-destruction on a scale so massive that the league may never fully recover from the backlash she's in. But if anyone thought the chaos would begin to cool down after the nuclear detonation of Stephanie White's comments and the league-wide uproar that followed, the third shockwave proved that this meltdown was nowhere near finished. Because just when the WNBA community tried to catch its breath, when executives began scrambling to find damage control strategies, when analysts attempted to shift the conversation back to basketball, a new, even more explosive layer erupted, thrusting the drama into a territory so intense, so unforgiving, and so humiliating that fans, critics, and insiders alike were left in utter disbelief as they watched the saga spiral into an uncontrollable freefall. Because this time, the backlash didn't just come from fans or commentators, it came from inside the league, from voices who normally stay silent, from players who rarely speak out, from insiders who had clearly reached their breaking point, unleashing a wave of raw, unfiltered truth bombs that shattered the league's polished image and exposed the festering tension that had been boiling beneath the surface for months. And suddenly, what started as a feud between a coach and a fanbase transformed into a massive, league-wide reckoning that no PR team could contain. No commissioner could soften, and no press statement could neutralize, because the critics weren't whispering, they were roaring, and the players weren't hinting, they were calling out hypocrisy, favoritism, incompetence, and a culture of hostility that had been allowed to thrive unchecked, and at the center of every accusation, every pointed remark, every thinly veiled jab, one name kept resurfacing like a battle flag: Caitlin Clark. The rookie phenomenon whose impact had already reshaped the WNBA economy but whose presence had now unintentionally forced the league to confront deeply embedded fractures that had long been ignored, and with each passing hour, as more voices joined the storm, as former players chimed in, as retired legends issued warnings, and as analysts dug deeper into the timeline of internal tensions, it became impossible to deny that the league was being pushed into a crossroads it could no longer avoid. A moment of truth where every unspoken conflict, every unacknowledged resentment, every unresolved grudge was exploding into the open at once like a chain reaction of emotional landmines. Revealing a league torn between those ready for growth and those terrified of losing control, between players who embraced the spotlight and those who resented it, between leaders pushing for modernity and leaders desperate to cling to outdated power structures. And the more the conversation intensified, the clearer it became that this wasn't just an ordinary chapter in the WNBA story. It was a collision of eras, an all-out ideological war disguised as a sports controversy, and at the eye of this raging storm stood Clark, not because she asked for it, not because she provoked it, but because her transformative presence forced the league to confront truths it had avoided for far too long. And as the firestorm spread, as insiders leaked reports of locker room discomfort, as coaching staffs whispered frustrations behind closed doors, as team executives panicked about ticket sales, media obligations, and upcoming schedules, and as fans battled each other fierce enough to fracture online communities that had once been unified, it became painfully obvious that the WNBA was experiencing not a mere controversy, but a historic implosion. The kind of internal collapse that sports historians will analyze for decades. A moment where every decision, every statement, every silence became part of a larger narrative about progress, envy, leadership, and the unstoppable rise of a superstar whose name had become synonymous with both transformation and turmoil. And now, as the world watches the league unravel in real time, as the fallout grows more complicated with each fresh revelation, as public opinion continues shifting like a storm-swallowed tide, one chilling question looms over every conversation, every broadcast, every social media thread, every locker room meeting. If the WNBA cannot control this chaos now, who, or what, will be left standing by the time the dust finally settles? And just when it felt like the WNBA had reached the peak of its internal chaos, just when the public meltdown seemed too massive, too exposed, and too unstable to possibly escalate further, the fourth wave hit, harder, louder, and more catastrophic than anything that came before it, because the league wasn't just dealing with outrage anymore, it was dealing with a full-scale infrastructure collapse of trust, a spiraling avalanche of betrayal, denial, backtracking, and finger-pointing that sent the entire sports world into a frenzy as everyone desperately tried to figure out how the situation had spiraled so far beyond control. And this time, the source of the explosion wasn't a coach, wasn't a player, wasn't a commentator, and wasn't a fan base. It was the league itself, the institution that was supposed to be the stabilizer, the anchor, the piece of the puzzle that remained calm while everyone else lost their minds. Yet instead, the WNBA's leadership walked straight into the firestorm with a statement so tone-deaf, so dismissive, so catastrophically miscalculated that it instantly became the most controversial league-issued message in years. Because rather than address the tension, rather than de-escalate the conflict, rather than acknowledge the fans, the culture, or the explosive pressure that had been building for months, the league doubled down on a message that felt cold, corporate, hostile, and shockingly disconnected, a message that attempted to portray the entire catastrophe as a miscommunication, a media exaggeration, and a temporary misunderstanding, which only made things infinitely worse. Because fans did not hear reassurance, they heard arrogance, they heard gaslighting, they heard an attempt to minimize everything they had witnessed with their own eyes. And the resulting backlash tore through social media with hurricane force as millions of supporters blasted the league for acting like the controversy didn't matter, like the tension wasn't Real, like the cracks weren't widening by the minute, and as the outrage intensified, analysts began pointing out something far more dangerous. The league's message didn't just ignore the fans, it appeared to protect certain individuals, certain narratives, and certain agendas at the expense of transparency, fairness, and accountability. And once that idea took root, the firestorm exploded into a new dimension, morphing from a debate about comments into a mass uproar about integrity, bias, favoritism, and the internal politics of a league that was now being accused of hiding its fractures behind the glitter of a rising superstar era. And with every passing hour, more insiders stepped forward with cryptic remarks. More former players issued veiled criticisms. More journalists hinted that bigger issues were being covered up. And suddenly the controversy had evolved into something far deeper, far uglier, and far more ominous. A widespread belief that the WNBA was fighting a war not just over narrative but over identity, struggling to decide whether it wanted to embrace the future or cling to the past, whether it wanted growth or control, whether it wanted players to shine or politics to dominate. And as fans dissected every word of the league's statement like evidence in a criminal investigation, as critics accused leadership of failing the moment, and as the sports world watched the situation collide with national media, it became brutally clear that this was not just a bump in the road, this was a historic crisis, a moment so big, so messy, and so revealing that it forced the entire league into a